the moon landing's darkest secret. On the evening of July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the surface of the moon. 600 million people around the world watched on television as he planted the American flag and declared this a giant leap for mankind. It was the greatest technological triumph in human history. It was a moment of pure American exceptionalism. It was a victory that defined a generation. But buried in that moment of glory was a secret so dark, so morally compromising, that the United States government actively concealed it for 15 years. The rocket that carried Armstrong to the moon was designed by a man who should have been hanged at Nuremberg. A man who presided over one of the most brutal concentration camps in Nazi Germany. A man personally responsible for the deaths of more than 20,000 human beings who were worked to death manufacturing weapons in underground tunnels. His name was Arthur Rudolph, and in May 1945, instead of putting him on trial, the United States Army gave him a new identity, a new life, and a ticket to America. They promised the world they would bring Nazi war criminals to justice. They promised that monsters who committed crimes against humanity would face the consequences. They promised that Nuremberg meant never again. Every single one of those promises was a lie. Within months of the Nuremberg trials, Arthur Rudolph was living comfortably in Texas, working for the United States Army. By 1969, he was the director of the Saturn V rocket program at NASA. The same man who had selected prisoners from concentration camps for slave labor was now being celebrated as an American hero. The rocket that took us to the moon was built with knowledge purchased in blood, and nobody talked about it. Let me take you back to the beginning, because this story starts not in 1969, but in 1943, in a place most Americans have never heard of. In October 1942, German scientists achieved something no nation had ever accomplished before. They launched a rocket into space. The V-2 rocket, designed by Wernher von Braun's team at Piemont, was the world's first ballistic missile. It could reach altitudes of 50 miles, travel at 3,500 miles per hour, and strike targets 200 miles away with no defense possible. Hitler was ecstatic. He saw the V-2 as his miracle weapon, the technology that would win the war, even as Germany was losing on every front. He ordered immediate mass production, thousands of rockets, as fast as possible. That is when Arthur Rudolph entered the story. There was a problem. Building rockets required skilled labor, precision manufacturing, and resources. Germany in 1943 had none of those things to spare. The Eastern Front was consuming every available worker. The Allied bombing campaign was destroying German factories. The Nazi war machine was running out of time. Arthur Rudolph, the chief V-2 production engineer, had a solution. On April 12, 1943, he wrote a memo recommending that the rocket program adopt the use of SS concentration camp prisoners as slave labor. He had seen this system work at an aircraft factory. Prisoners cost nothing to feed, nothing to house, nothing to pay. If they died, there were always more. His recommendation was approved immediately. On June 17, 1943, the first concentration camp prisoners arrived at Piemont. But that was just the beginning. After British bombers devastated Piemont in August 1943, Hitler and Heinrich Himmler made a decision. They would move V-2 production completely underground, into tunnels carved out of a mountain near the town of Nordhausen in central Germany. The facility was called Mittelwerk, the Central Works, and Arthur Rudolph was appointed as its technical operations director. His job was simple: produce as many V-2 rockets as possible, as fast as possible, using slave labor from a new concentration camp called Mittelbau-Dora. What happened in those tunnels between September 1943 and April 1945 was one of the most horrific chapters of the Holocaust. The tunnels were 4 miles long, carved into solid rock. There was no sunlight, no fresh air, no sanitation. Prisoners worked 18-hour shifts with minimal food and water. They slept on wooden shelves stacked 4 high in the tunnels themselves. Typhus, tuberculosis, and dysentery were rampant. The SS guards hanged prisoners publicly for alleged sabotage as a warning to others. Between 30 and 50% of the 60,000 prisoners who passed through Mittelbau-Dora died there. That is between 20,000 and 25,000 human beings. More people died building the V-2 rocket than were killed by it when it was deployed against Britain. Arthur Rudolph was there for all of it. He walked those tunnels. He inspected the production lines. He reported directly to the SS on labor quotas and rocket output. When asked about the hangings decades later, he said, "I think they were Russians." By early 1945, the Nazi regime was collapsing. The Red Army was approaching from the east. Allied forces were crossing the Rhine from the west. The Thousand-Year Reich had months left. On April 11th, 1945, American soldiers liberated the Mittelbau-Dora camp. What they found was beyond comprehension. Thousands of corpses, piles of bodies stacked like firewood. Survivors so emaciated they looked like skeletons. The tunnels still filled with half-finished rockets. At least 70 American soldiers would die from disease contracted at the camp or during the death marches that preceded liberation. The officers who arrived first assumed that anyone connected to this place would face immediate execution or trial for war crimes. They were wrong. In the fall of 1944, months before Germany surrendered, a group of American intelligence officers had been conducting a secret mission. They were embedded with Allied forces, searching not for Nazi soldiers, but for Nazi scientists. Their orders came from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Find the rocket scientists. Find the chemical weapons experts. Find the aircraft designers. Secure them before the Soviets do. The mission was initially called Operation Overcast, but it was later renamed Operation Paperclip because officers attached paperclips to the files of the most troublesome cases. Those are the scientists whose Nazi records were so damning that bringing them to America would require falsifying documents and concealing evidence of war crimes. Arthur Rudolph was one of those cases. When American forces arrived at Nordhausen in May 1945, Arthur Rudolph surrendered willingly. He told his interrogators that he was just an engineer. He said he had no involvement with the concentration camp system. He claimed he was simply doing his job, designing rockets. He was lying. The Americans knew he was lying. The paperwork in the tunnels proved he was lying, but they brought him to America anyway. The decision was made at the highest levels. President Harry Truman approved Operation Paperclip in September 1946. The United States needed German rocket technology for the coming Cold War with the Soviet Union. The Soviets were capturing German scientists too. If America did not take these men, Stalin would. And so, Arthur Rudolph, who had overseen the deaths of 20,000 people in underground tunnels, was given a new file with a sanitized history, put on a ship, and sent to Fort Bliss, Texas. He would never face trial. He would never be indicted. He would never be punished. Now, here's the part that should keep you awake at night. Arthur Rudolph was not an isolated case. Operation Paperclip brought more than 1,600 Nazi scientists, engineers, and doctors to the United States. Many of them had direct involvement in war crimes, human experimentation, and slave labor. Wernher von Braun, who became the face of NASA and the hero of the space program, had personally chaired meetings that recommended using concentration camp labor for rocket production. He had visited Mittelbau-Dora. He had seen the conditions. He had done nothing to stop it. Kurt Blome, a Nazi doctor who conducted biological weapons experiments that killed dozens of people, was brought to America and worked for the U.S. Army Chemical Corps. Walter Schreiber, another Nazi doctor involved in horrific medical experiments, ended up at the Air Force School of Medicine in Texas. None of them ever faced justice. In 1945, the United States faced a choice: uphold the principles of justice that we had just fought a world war to defend, or compromise those principles to gain a strategic advantage against the Soviet Union. America chose advantage. Today, we face similar choices constantly. Do we support authoritarian regimes because they provide oil or military bases? Do we overlook human rights abuses because a country is economically important? Do we make deals with monsters because they are useful monsters? The pattern is identical. The decision to bring Arthur Rudolph and the other Nazi scientists to America was made in secret. Congress did not vote on it. The American public was not consulted. The details remained classified for more than 25 years. Even in Nuremberg, prosecutors were kept in the dark. By the time ordinary Americans learned the truth, these men had already been integrated into American society. They had security clearances. They had government jobs. They had American citizenship. The same pattern exists today. Intelligence agencies make deals, sign agreements, and commit American resources to projects that the public learns about only years later, if ever. Unelected officials decide what principles are negotiable, and by the time we find out, it is too late to do anything about it. By the 1960s, Arthur Rudolph was a celebrated figure. He was the director of the Saturn V program at NASA. He received the Distinguished Service Medal. He was invited to the White House. When Apollo 11 landed on the moon, he stood in mission control and received a standing ovation. The 20,000 people who died in the tunnels at Mittelbau-Dora were never mentioned. Today, we name buildings after people who made fortunes through exploitation. We celebrate business leaders who built empires on sweatshop labor. We give awards to politicians who supported wars that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. The same selective memory. And here's what makes this story even darker. The United States government knew the truth the entire time. In 1979, the Office of Special Investigations was created within the Department of Justice. Its mission was to find Nazi war criminals living in the United States and bring them to justice. When they investigated Arthur Rudolph in 1983, they found mountains of evidence. Documents showing he had requested concentration camp labor. Testimony from survivors describing his role in the camp. Records proving he had lied on his immigration forms about his Nazi activities. The evidence was overwhelming. But instead of putting him on trial, the Justice Department made him a deal. Leave the country voluntarily. Surrender your American citizenship, and we will not prosecute you. In 1984, Arthur Rudolph left the United States and moved to West Germany. He died in 1996, never having faced a single day in court. The American government chose, once again, to avoid the embarrassment of admitting what they had done. Arthur Rudolph's story is not just about one man. It is about a system that values results over principles. It is about a government that decides some crimes are forgivable if the criminal is useful enough. It is about a society that celebrates achievements without asking how they were accomplished. America's mistake was not just bringing Nazi war criminals to America. America's mistake was believing that you can build something good on a foundation of evil without consequences. America's mistake was thinking that the ends justify the means, that winning the space race mattered more than honoring the dead. America's mistake was assuming that nobody would ever find out, or that if they did, they would not care. We are making those exact same mistakes today. We make deals with dictators and tell ourselves it is pragmatic. We support regimes that commit atrocities and call it realpolitik. We celebrate innovations without asking who paid the real price for them. Let me tell you something that most people do not understand. The institutions that control power learn a lesson from Operation Paperclip. They learned that the American public has a very short memory. They learned that if you wait long enough, even the most horrific compromises become normalized. They learned that people care more about success than about how that success was achieved. When Apollo 11 landed on the moon, did anyone ask about Arthur Rudolph? No. They asked how soon we could go back. The 20,000 people who died building the rockets that made that moment possible were irrelevant. That is the game. Commit the crime in secret. Wait for the statute of limitations to expire or for public attention to fade. Then celebrate the achievement and hope nobody connects the dots. It worked in 1969. It is working today. There is something else about Operation Paperclip that most people do not understand. You never had a choice. The decision to bring Nazi war criminals to America was made by a handful of military intelligence officers and approved by the president. No congressional hearing, no public debate, no vote. By the time the American people learned the truth, Arthur Rudolph had already designed the rocket that went to the moon. Your tax dollars paid his salary for nearly 40 years. You paid to protect a man who should have been executed, and nobody asked your permission. That same dynamic exists today. The decisions that will define your country's moral standing for the next generation are being made right now behind closed doors by people you will never meet. And they're betting that by the time you find out, you will be too tired or too distracted to care. Here is what happened in 1945. The United States had a choice: justice or expediency, principles or pragmatism, honor or advantage. We chose expediency, and for 40 years, nobody talked about it. Arthur Rudolph lived a comfortable life in America, celebrated as a hero, while the survivors of Mittelbau-Dora lived with nightmares and the knowledge that the man who presided over their suffering had never been punished. That is the cost of compromise. Not just what you lose in the moment, but what you teach the next generation about what matters. We taught a generation of Americans that winning is more important than how you win, that success erases crimes, that monsters can become heroes if they are useful enough. And now we are surprised when the same logic is applied again and again. In 1945, there were people who objected to Operation Paperclip. There were military officers who said this was wrong. There were prosecutors at Nuremberg who wanted these men tried for war crimes. There were survivors who demanded justice. They were overruled. The people who made the decision to bring Arthur Rudolph to America told themselves it was necessary. They told themselves the Cold War was more important than justice for 20,000 dead prisoners. They told themselves that nobody would remember in 20 years anyway. They were wrong about that last part. The survivors remembered. The families of the dead remembered. And eventually, the truth came out. But by then, Arthur Rudolph had lived a full life. He had raised a family in America. He had built a career. He had received honors and awards. And the people who died in the tunnels at Mittelbau-Dora remained dead, their suffering unacknowledged, their deaths unavenged. You have the same choice right now, not about Nazi war criminals. That chapter is over, but about the compromises your government is making today in your name, about the dictators we support because they're strategically useful, about the human rights abuses we overlook because trade matters more, about the whistleblowers we prosecute while the crimes they exposed go unpunished. How much injustice are you willing to accept in exchange for convenience? How many principles are you willing to compromise for economic advantage? At what point does winning cost too much? These are not abstract questions. They're the same questions Americans should have asked in 1945. They're the same questions Germans should have asked in 1933. They're the questions that define whether a society has a moral center or just a list of interests. Arthur Rudolph died in 1996 in Hamburg, Germany. He never expressed remorse for his role at Mittelbau-Dora. He never acknowledged the suffering he caused. He maintained until his death that he was just an engineer doing his job. The American government never apologized for bringing him here. NASA never revoked his medals. The Saturn V rocket is still celebrated as one of humanity's greatest engineering achievements. And somewhere in that celebration, 20,000 people who died building the technology that made it possible have been forgotten. That is the cost of choosing expedience over principle. Not just the immediate injustice, but the long-term moral rot, the willingness to look away, the ability to celebrate an achievement without honoring its true cost. The comfort of forgetting. I'm not telling you to be angry. I'm telling you to remember that every time we compromise our principles for short-term advantage, we pay a price that compounds over generations. To remember that monsters do not always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like heroes. To remember that the decisions being made today in secret will define what kind of country we are 50 years from now. History is warning us. The question is, are you listening?